hearing will come to order. And before we begin our formal business, let me first extend a welcome to our new Finance Committee members. We have Senator Marshall on the Republican side. Welcome, Senator. And on the Democrat side, we have Senators Lujan, Sanders, Smith, Warnock, and Welch. We welcome you all to the committee as well. You all bring great expertise to the committee, and we look forward to working with you. I'm also honored to lead this committee alongside Ranking Member Wyden. Senator Wyden and I have a proven track record of working together to improve the lives of our constituents in the Pacific Northwest and on this committee. And we can and will do so again in this Congress. I look forward to working with you, Senator Wyden. This committee's jurisdiction, tax, trade, and healthcare policy reflects some of the most challenging matters that Congress confronts. The Finance Committee will continue its long tradition of addressing these matters in a manner that invites bipartisanship and delivers results to create opportunities for Americans. Turning to today's hearing, let me extend a warm welcome to Mr. Scott Bessent, President Trump's nominee for the Secretary of the Treasury, as well as his family. Congratulations, Mr. Bessent, on your well-deserved nomination, and thank you for your willingness to serve and for your extensive cooperation with this committee. It has already been a great pleasure to work with you. You've been transparent, candid, and insightful with me and with my colleagues. You've spent countless hours meaningfully answering our questions and according yourself with great courtesy, dignity, and professionalism. Throughout the committee's rigorous vetting process, and I think that our Finance Committee has the most rigorous process of any committee in the Congress, you have worked tirelessly to meet our long-standing diligence standard. It's clear that you followed applicable law and provided thousands of pages of documentation that substantiate your positions supported by major law and accounting firms. Thank you for your transparency and responsiveness throughout the Finance Committee's exacting process, and I look forward to continuing to work together with you. Mr. Bessent has worked for the last 3 decades as one of the sharpest minds in the global finance industry, including as an entrepreneur who started his own asset management firm. He taught economic history at Yale University, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, has served on the board of universities and nonprofits, and engages in a variety of philanthropic endeavors. Mr. Bessent, based upon your background, experience, and character, President Trump made an excellent choice in nominating you to be Secretary of Treasury. As you have described it, the position for which you are nominated is at the heart of the American economy, which is in turn at the heart of global economic growth. A Treasury Secretary heads the agency charged with supporting economic growth, representing U.S. interests before foreign nations and global financial markets and organizations, managing the federal treasury and overseeing financial institutions, to name just a few of the responsibilities. Past successful Treasury Secretaries have understood business and financial markets, as well as foreign policy and national security, budgets, and regulation. They have worked collaboratively with Congress to enact the President's priorities. Additionally, they have been forthright and communicative. The next Treasury Secretary will have to work with Congress to preserve and build on the pro-growth Republican tax policies that have greatly benefited all Americans, as well as improve our global competitiveness through trade deals that create market access and combat China's unfair practices. As seen in the results of our most recent election, American voters resoundingly support returning to the robust economy that we enjoyed during President Trump's first term. If you're confirmed, I look forward to working closely with you to achieve these and other essential aims. Mr. Bessent, on behalf of my colleagues, I thank you for your willingness to serve and again congratulate you on your support and on your nomination, which I intend to support. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Wyden for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your introducing all the new members on both sides, and as always, your very kind comments about me. Very much appreciated. In a Trump economy, the winner's circle is small, and it's dominated by the ultra-wealthy. Working people and the middle class are on the outside looking in, and Trump and his advisors are indifferent to the problems they face each day. I've had more than 1,100 open to all town hall meetings in my state. I'll have several more this weekend. The second word I hear from Oregonians in those meetings is almost always bill. Grocery bill, medical bill, electricity bill. Americans feel held down by the cost of living. They look at the growing fortunes at the top and they weigh that against their sense that America's middle class just doesn't have the opportunities to really get ahead. The American people voted for change, and more than anywhere else, they want change in the economy. I don't believe they're going to get it from Mr. Bessent or Donald Trump. The centerpiece of the Trump economic agenda is extending his 2017 tax law at a cost of more than $4 trillion. Ultra-wealthy individuals who rake in millions each year would get tax breaks of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Families who live paycheck to paycheck would be lucky if they could just get enough to cover the grocery bill for a week. How does Donald Trump and Republicans plan to pay for their multi-trillion-dollar giveaways to the ultra-wealthy? For starters, they'll be offering across-the-board tariffs. And let's be clear about what that's all about. Trillions of dollars in new taxes paid for by working Americans and small businesses. And to me, the ultimate distillation of the Trump agenda is paying for tax breaks for the top by increasing child hunger, booting tens of millions off their health insurance, and laying off hundreds of thousands of manufacturing workers. It feels to me like a class war on typical American families. And the nominee, if confirmed, is going to be right in the middle of it. Donald Trump's going to be waging this class war instead of fixing what's broken about the tax code, which is there's a special set of rules that apply only to the ultra-wealthy. Make no mistake about it. Those ultra-wealthy people get to pay what they want when they want to, and often little or nothing for years on end. Mr. Bessent is a case in point. The taxes that fund Medicare are automatic for the vast majority of Americans. They come straight out of every paycheck. It's a civic duty that pays off as earned benefits down the road. But like a number of Wall Street fund managers, Mr. Bessent makes use of a tricky legal maneuver to opt out of paying into Medicare. It's a tax loophole that hurts Medicare, but benefits him to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. Now, the Treasury Department has gone to court to argue that taxpayers taking this position are violating tax law. Make no mistake about that. That's not me making the judgment. That's the Treasury Department. They went to court to argue that taxpayers who take this position are violating the law. I believe it's a big conflict of interest if the nominee is confirmed. Either he and his lawyers take the position that Treasury policy doesn't apply to the Treasury Secretary, or he blesses a loophole that lets Wall Street titans blow off their fair share of Medicare taxes. This is exactly the kind of abusive scheme that leaves Americans feeling disgusted with the tax code. They feel it every spring when they go to file their taxes through the big software companies as well. It's absurd that Americans get charged huge amounts of money to file their taxes every year. That's why a number of us in this room worked hard to create the new direct file program with resources from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden administration. It's a free option that allows taxpayers to file their returns directly to the IRS. No software middlemen picking their pockets or harvesting their data. It launched last year to rave reviews, and virtually nowhere in the Western industrialized world do we have the kind of bureaucratic, costly system we have today, and we're trying to change it. 35 million Americans across 25 states, 30 million Americans across 25 states are going to be eligible to use direct file this year. That's if it continues to survive. The software giants want direct file killed. Republicans are on their side, so maybe they're going to get their way. If they do, it'll cost American taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars this year alone. Trump and Republicans aren't stopping there when it comes to siding with special interests over the typical consumer. The Inflation Reduction Act was the largest investment in clean energy in our history. It was largely developed in this room, and it took years to try to find the common ground around technological neutrality. And the more you reduce carbon, the bigger your tax savings. It's created hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's saving consumers money on their energy bills. And along with record fossil fuel production, it's brought energy security to a level not seen in generations. Our country is in a clean energy arms race with China and other powers. But unfortunately, these policies from Donald Trump and Republicans may prevent us from winning that arms race with China. That's because the Trump administration is talking about selling out to special interests and far-right ideologues that want to nuke the provisions of the IRA that help us promote clean energy. They want to keep in place the oil and gas subsidies that have been around for more than a generation, but eliminate the incentives that put us in the lead on clean energy. From what I've read, that's how the nominee sees it as well. That would be a recipe for higher energy costs, weaker energy security, and surrender to China when it comes to clean energy jobs and investment. In my view, that just defies common sense. I'll close with this. Many people, myself included, hoped that the president-elect would pick a steady hand for Treasury Secretary, someone who would be a moderating force, who'd work with all sides, and especially for the interests of all Americans, for a tax code that gives everybody in America the chance to get ahead, not just the people at the top. So this is an important discussion today. And I wish I had read something that would indicate that this nominee would be the kind of Treasury Secretary I described. That's why we have the hearing, to get his views. Thank you, Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Senator Wyden. And today, we are honored to have our good friend and colleague, and now the new Budget Committee Chairman, Senator Lindsey Graham, to help introduce the nominee. Welcome, Senator Graham, from the great state of South Carolina. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce Mr. Bessent.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ranking member to all my colleagues, and there are only 100 of us. We know each other pretty well. This is my first appearance in the Finance Committee, probably last. Y'all work on complicated stuff, and I'm glad you like this stuff. It seems kind of boring to me, but it's important what you do, and I respect the intellect of the people on this committee because our economy needs the best minds that we can find on the Finance Committee. And we need a Secretary of Treasury that knows what he's doing, has the trust of the President, and loves his country. Your ship came in with this guy. So Scott Bessent's from South Carolina. He's academically gifted and real-world tested. He went to Yale, so nobody's perfect. When he told me that, I said, I don't know about that. But anyway, he's really, really smart, and this is a complicated area. Now, why am I here? Because Trump won. I wouldn't be here if Trump hadn't won. Trump won because more people voted for him. And he had to pick people to form his cabinet. And when he talked about the Secretary of Treasury, I'm not the normal person you would go to ask about, because this is not so much my portfolio. But when he mentioned Scott, I said, oh my God, home run, from my point of view. I mean, you talk about somebody who's academically gifted, understands the world. Scott, like any Republican president, would pick Scott. I mean, he's really understands the president and what the president wants to do. And the reason I vote for almost everybody, for every president, is I believe, colleagues, that every president deserves a cabinet that they know and trust and can rely upon. If I had to vote for people based on agreeing with them, I wouldn't vote for anybody y'all picked. That's not the standard for me. I vote for people who I disagree with because I think they're qualified. So I would just ask the committee to think for a minute, is this man qualified? Does he have the background and the intelligence and the character to serve President Trump and our nation's Secretary of Treasury? I think by any reasonable test of qualifications, he excels beyond the bare minimum to the highest level of excellence. But that's just my opinion. So my goal here today is to tell you a little bit about him. You've heard from the chairman about his success in the financial world, about his academic qualifications. He was born in Little River, South Carolina. Why do they call it Little River? Because it's little, and it's a river. It's in Horry County. How many of you heard of Myrtle Beach? Most of you. Well, this is somewhere between Conway and Myrtle Beach. At 9 years old, his first job was to set up beach chairs and umbrellas in North Myrtle Beach. And apparently you did well there, because North Myrtle Beach is thriving. He went to North Myrtle Beach High School, and he was voted most likely to succeed in 1980. And we have a high school classmate of his. What did they see in him? The same thing I see. Someone who really is talented and works hard and just a good person. The type of people that you think are going to succeed, but you hope succeed. So he lives in Charleston, in a really nice place. Going from Little River to Charleston is about a 2.5-hour drive, but it's a real change. Since I represent South Carolina, I like them both very much. He's married, John, his husband's right behind me. We have 2 kids, Caroline and Cole, and they're absolutely adorable. And from a South Carolina point of view, we're really proud of Scott. I was over the top happy when President Trump picked him, because I know him. I know where he came from. The rich and powerful don't live in Little River. This is truly the American dream. This man has been successful at everything he's ever tried to do. He's worked really hard. And why did President Trump pick him? Because he believes that President Trump's economic agenda is good for this country, and he wants to help President Trump be successful. And here's what Scott said. I think it's the melding of economic policy with national security. Economic policy and national security are now indispensable, and Donald Trump understands that. So I'm here to tell you, folks, I agree with that. If we don't have energy independence, we're less safe. If we don't get our debt in order, we're less safe. I am known around here as kind of a national security guy, but I do understand economic policy matters. If you want to clean up the environment, a carbon fee seems to be a good way to do it, to punish China and India for bad carbon practices. Call it a tariff, call it whatever you want to do. So President Trump won. I'm here today because he won. I'm here today because Scott lives in South Carolina. I'm here today to tell you If you use qualifications as your test, this is the easiest vote you'll ever take. If your goal is to play like the election didn't happen, then I guess you'll vote no. That's just where we're headed in the Senate. When you lose an election, you get up and dust yourself off and you get ready for the next one. But I was honored when he asked me to introduce him, because I know this man, and America will be in good hands if he's our Secretary of Treasury. He deserves this job, he's qualified for this job, and President Trump, thank you for picking him. On behalf of all of us in South Carolina, we're extremely proud of you, and we wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. We appreciate you giving this introduction, and you are now excused, as is our practice. And Mr. Bessent, before we turn it over to you for your opening statement, I have 4 questions that we ask all nominees who come before this committee. The first is there anything that you are aware of in your background that might present a conflict of interest with the duties of the office to which you have been nominated?
No, sir.
Second, do you know of any reason, personal or otherwise, that would in any way prevent you from fully and honorably discharging the responsibilities of the office to which you've been nominated?
No, sir.
Third, do you agree without reservation to respond to any reasonable summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Congress if you are confirmed?
Yes, sir.
And finally, do you commit to provide a prompt response in writing to any question addressed to you by any senator on this committee?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Again, welcome to the committee, Mr. Bessent, and you may make your opening statement.
Good. Thank you. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the Finance Committee. It's an honor and a privilege to be considered by this committee as the President's nominee for the Secretary of the Treasury. I want to thank all of you who took the time to meet with me over the past few weeks. I want to thank my spouse, John Freeman, who is here today, and my wonderful children, Cole and Caroline,
Mike, I'm not sure if his mic's working.
who are sitting behind me.
Mr. Bessent, could you pull the microphone a little closer to you?
Who are sitting behind me for the ultimate civics lesson. I want to acknowledge 3 people who couldn't be here today. My 98-year-old mother-in-law, Celine Freeman, a World War II French war bride of an American soldier who lives with us in Charleston, South Carolina, making for a 3-generation household. My sister, Paige McLeod Bessent, who doesn't like crowds and prefers the mountains of South Carolina to large cities, and my recently deceased sister, Wynn Bessent, who worked tirelessly as a public defender in one of South Carolina's poorest counties. I also want to thank President Donald Trump for having placed his trust and confidence in me for such an important role in his administration. While I have met with many of you, most Americans watching at home will be unfamiliar with my background. I have been blessed with a fulfilling and successful career, but my presence here today was far from predetermined. I was born and raised in the South Carolina Lowcountry. My father fell into extreme financial difficulty when I was young. When I was 9 years old, I started working 2 summer jobs, and I haven't stopped working since. I eventually made my way to Yale. I accepted my first internship in finance because the job came with a pull-out sofa in the office to sleep on, which allowed me to live in New York City rent-free. I've been involved in the financial markets ever since. I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the world's greatest investors in a career that has taken me to almost 60 countries over 40 years. My life has been the only in America story that I am determined to preserve for future generations. Today, I believe that President Trump has a generational opportunity to unleash a new economic golden age that will create more jobs, wealth, and prosperity for all Americans. My life's work in the private sector has given me a deep understanding of the economy and markets. And while this experience will be invaluable in crafting economic policy, I have long adhered to the principle that you should know what you don't know and lean on those who do. Having never served in government, I intend, if confirmed, to be in close contact with each of you in your offices and seek your counsel. The Treasury Department plays a critical role in protecting American national security. We must secure supply chains that are vulnerable to strategic competitors, and we must carefully deploy sanctions as part of a whole-of-government approach to address our national security requirements. And critically, we must ensure that the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency. Today, Americans face significant challenges in an economy that has not created enough opportunities for working men and women. We have an affordability crisis, a housing shortage, and for the first time in my lifetime, parents feel as though the American dream is slipping away from their children. The federal government has a significant spending problem, driving deficits that have averaged an historically high 7% of GDP during the past 4 years. We must work to get our fiscal house in order and adjust federal domestic discretionary spending that has grown by an astonishing 40% over the past 4 years. Productive investment that grows the economy must be prioritized over wasteful spending that drives inflation. As we begin 2025, Americans are barreling towards an economic crisis at year-end. If Congress fails to act, Americans will face the largest tax increase in history, a crushing $4 trillion tax hike. We must make permanent the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and implement new pro-growth policies to reduce the tax burden on American manufacturers, service workers, and seniors. I've already spoken with several members of the committee, as well as leaders of the House, about the best approach to achieving these important goals together. As President Trump has said, we will unleash the American economy by implementing pro-growth regulatory policies, reducing taxes, and unleashing American energy production. The breadth and depth of our capital markets, along with predictable pro-growth tax policy and smart updated regulation, will continue to make America the most popular destination in the world for starting, growing, and taking public a business. And as we rebuild our economy and lay the foundation for the next generation of American competitiveness, we must use all the tools available to realign the economic system to better serve the interest of working Americans. For too long, our nation has allowed unfair distortions in the international trading system. President Trump was the first president in modern times to recognize the need to change our trade policy and stand up for American workers. If confirmed, I look forward to working with President Trump and members of this committee to do just that. Members of the committee, these are just some of many important goals that President Trump has laid out for me and others on his economic team. I firmly believe that if confirmed, and with your counsel and support, we can usher in a new, more balanced era of prosperity that will lift up all Americans and rebuild communities and families across the country. I humbly thank you for your consideration and am eager to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bessent. Before I begin my questions, I want to reemphasize how appreciative I am of your diligence in the process that we've gone through vetting here in this Senate. I appreciate the more than 3,000 pages of supporting material you've provided, as well as the countless hours you and your staff have offered to respond to questions from members of this committee. Let me be clear. You followed all of the applicable law and met the committee's long-standing diligence standard. Your process matched that which has applied to nominees in every previous administration. And I want to go in my first question to you to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which Senator Wyden and I have both mentioned already, and you've mentioned in your remarks. The attack on this statute, this law, which is law, I remind everybody it is the law now, it was passed in 2017, is that it was a tax cut for the wealthy. I appreciate you, Mr. Bessent, noting that it will be a $4+ trillion tax increase if we do not extend this law. And a point that I would remind all of my colleagues is that if that $4+ trillion tax increase happens, it's not just going to be something that impacts the wealthy. It is 2.6 trillion of it. The majority of it falls on people who make less $400,000 for a family with 2 taxpayers, for under $400,000 per year. That's the number that President Biden chose to say he wanted to protect it. 2.6 trillion of this tax cut hits those making less than $400,000. Moreover, massive amounts of it hit pass-through entities, small businesses across this country. This is not a tax cut for the wealthy that we're talking about. It is a tax increase on all Americans, the majority of whom are in the lower and middle income categories. My question to you is, one of our pivotal tasks is to make sure that this tax increase does not happen. Can you give us your perspective on the impact that would occur in this country if we allowed this $4 trillion tax increase to happen?
Senator Crapo, thank you for this, and thank you for the meetings over the past few weeks. I've enjoyed working with your staff, and this is the single most important economic issue of the day. This is pass-fail. That if we do not fix these tax cuts, if we do not renew and extend, then we will be facing an economic calamity, and as always, with financial instability, that falls on the middle and working class people. We will see a gigantic middle class tax increase. We will see the child tax credit halved. We will see the deductions halved. So it will be what we call in economics, it has the potential for a sudden stop. And as I said, traditionally with these sudden stops, it falls on working Americans.
Thank you. And I would just say to you, you may be aware of this, but the Tax Foundation has indicated that if we do sustain these tax cuts and protect them from expiring and stop this tax increase, that the extension of this policy would increase the growth of the GDP in the United States by 1.1% over time. Similarly, and I don't know how they came up with the same number, but the National Association of Manufacturers indicates that if we don't extend this tax relief, that there will be a 1.1% reduction in growth of jobs and development in our economy. It seems to me that as we are talking about what to do for America, that protecting America from a 1% reduction versus a 1% growth in GDP is a critical objective. Could you just give a little bit of perspective? I know you've just answered this question in another context, but could you just give a little bit more perspective on those kinds of dynamics? And I'm sorry, I'm going to try to keep to 5 minutes, and we've only got about 15 seconds left of mine, and I want to be sure everybody else stays on time, so I will too. Could you quickly respond?
Well, Senator, I would just say that we saw the power of these tax cuts in 18, 19, and going into January of 20 before they were interrupted by COVID, and the great success that we had.
Thank you. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say to the nominee, I've got 4 questions that I'm going to ask, and if we both can keep it brief, I think we can get to all of them, because I think it really frames for us what the debate is all about. I'm going to start by talking about the future of direct file. This is the program that helps our people who choose it to save hundreds of dollars when they file their tax return. Last year, the IRS launched it. It was enormously popular among taxpayers, but of course, the tax software giants and their big lobby just hate it. They want to shut it down. Now, the filing season starts January 27th, so it opens in 10 days, and millions of taxpayers around the country have already been notified that they are going to be eligible to use direct file this year. So I won't do this for every question, but I'd really like a yes or no on this one. Will you commit to keeping direct file up and running if you're confirmed?
I will commit that for this tax season, that direct file will be operative, and the American taxpayers who choose to use it will. And if confirmed, I will consult and study the program and understand it better and make sure that it works to serve the IRS's three goals of collections, customer service, and privacy.
I appreciate the answer. It means that taxpayers are going to save, who choose to use it because it's voluntary, hundreds of dollars, and we'll have a chance to see once again how popular it is with practically everybody except the tax prep software crowd. On to tariffs. Donald Trump, with no plan and no strategy, says he's going to put across-the-board tariffs, blanket tariffs on all imported goods, which means that our workers and our small businesses are going to get clobbered with additional taxes on practically everything they buy from other countries. My question here is, who would pay these tariffs? Americans or foreign countries?
So this, Senator Wyden, just to understand, so I can frame the answer correctly, do you believe that these tariffs are a consumption tax increase?
I believe these tariffs, you can call it whatever you want in terms of trying to gussy it up. They're going to be paid for by our workers and small businesses. And all through the campaign, we heard they weren't, that foreign countries were going to pay it. I think that's baloney. It's going to be paid for by workers and small businesses. So, your response?
Yes, Senator, I would respectfully disagree. And the history of tariffs and tariff theory, optimal tariff theory, does not support what you're saying. Traditionally, we see that the current, if we were to say use a number that has been thrown around in the press of 10%, then traditionally the currency appreciates by 4%, so the 10% is not passed through. Then we have various elasticities, consumer preferences may change, and finally, foreign manufacturers, especially China, which is trying to export their way out of their current economic malaise, they will continue cutting prices to maintain market share.
Okay. That's an academic view of it. But what I know is the history of this is it clobbers people of modest means. They're the people who are going to get hit. And all through the campaign, there was a big show that it was going to be paid for by foreigners, not so. Two other questions I want to get in. And I already made it clear, and you and I talked about this. I'm for a tax code that gives everybody the opportunity to get ahead. You and I talked about my friend Bill Bradley. He and I have been working for this for years. Do you believe the tax code should treat wages differently than it treats wealth?
Look, in any tax system that advantages and creates distortions, it is a change that, Senator, it is a decision that was made when the tax codes were written, and so every tax code involves the trade-offs and distortions in favor of other the gains.
It sounds to me like you do believe that it's fine to treat wealth more favorably. I couldn't disagree more. The idea that a dollar earned by a hedge fund manager has more value than a dollar earned by a teacher or a factory worker, I just think it's a disconnect with the American people. One last question, and that is about the legislation that was written in this room that was the biggest transformation on clean energy in American history. That is our package that basically said the tax code as it relates to energy is a broken down mess. And we basically said we're going to have a technology neutral system. The more you reduce carbon, the bigger your tax savings. Now there is a big effort in the Trump administration to reverse it. I think that's going to be bad for the economy, but it is going to be damn good for China because we are in an arms race on clean energy with them. Are you going to be on the side of people who want to unravel this?
Senator Wyden, just so we can frame this for everyone in the room, China will build 100 new coal plants this year. There is not a clean energy race. There is an energy race. China will build 10 nuclear plants this year. That is not solar. I am in favor of more nuclear plants. And I would note that the IRA, as scored by the CBO, is wildly out of control in terms of spending on the upside.
Well, first of all, the clean energy package does protect nuclear because members on both sides of the aisle in this room wanted it to be that way. But if you're going to talk about fossils, the United States has achieved a greater level of energy security than we've had in generations. Oil and gas production is at record highs. And it's not just that, but it's about clean energy. And I'm very troubled by your position denying that we're in an arms race with China on clean energy, because we definitely are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We do need to move on. And I told Senator Wyden he could have those 4 questions, but I want to remind everybody else we've got a 5-minute time limit. He deserved those extra questions. Senator Grassley.
Mr. Bessent, congratulations. I want to start out with where you and I talked about something in my office, and you remember that tongue-in-cheek comment I made to you that you were going to be asked by the chairman, will you answer all of our letters? And everybody that comes to the Hill says, yes, they're going to. And I said, maybe you better say maybe, because most people don't keep that promise. So I just wanted to remind you, if I write you a letter on my oversight responsibilities, I'd appreciate it if you'd answer it. Now to my first question. My Democrat colleagues believe, you gonna put that up? My Democrat colleagues believe the only solution to our unsustainable debt and deficit is higher tax rates and that ends up being on job creators and families alike. However, history proves that high tax rates fail to raise significant revenues. Taxpayers, workers, and investors are smarter than that. In other words, they're smarter than we in Congress that thinks that at one time a 93% marginal tax rate would bring in more revenue than a 70% tax rate or a 50% tax rate or a 30% tax rate or a 40% tax rate and so on. But as you can see from this chart, Congress isn't too smart because the taxpayers decide how much money they're going to bring into the federal treasury. Now, on the other side of the ledger, federal spending is at levels we've never seen outside of war and recession and still growing. So I'm making a statement to you, but if you'd like to comment on whether or not we have a fiscal imbalance primarily or a spending problem rather than a revenue problem.
Senator Grassley, I enjoyed visiting you in your office, and will remind you that when we were talking about the American agriculture, that I may be the first Treasury Secretary nominee in a long time who knows what a section is, 642 acres, and am involved in the farming business. And yes, we do not have a revenue problem in the United States of America. We have a spending problem. That historically, for the past 40 or 50 years, revenues, federal government revenues, have averaged about 17 to 17.5% of GDP. And spending has been slightly over that, leading us to a 3.5% budget deficit, which is manageable because we have roughly 3.8% nominal growth, 1.8% real growth, 2% inflation. Today, as you stated, and to be clear, this is one of the things that got me out from behind my desk and my quiet life in this campaign, was the thought that this spending is out of control. We are spending about 25% of GDP. So as you said, 6.8 to 7% deficit. We have never seen this before when it is not a recession or not a war. And I am concerned because several times the Treasury of the United States has been called upon to save the nation, whether it was the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, or the recent COVID epidemic. Treasury, along with full government and Congress, has used its borrowing capacity to save the Union, to save the world, and to save the American people. And what we currently have now, we would be hard-pressed to do same.
My last question is one I ask a lot of people to come from Treasury. While I oppose tax hikes on individuals, families, and small businesses, I've long championed sensible policies geared towards shutting down tax loopholes and providing tools to IRS to detect tax cheats. A primary example is my legislation that I authored in 2006, the IRS whistleblower law. It's brought $6 billion back into the federal treasury. This program could raise billions more if IRS would use it to its full potential. So I hope I can count on you if you're confirmed, and I think you'll be confirmed, to be supportive of this whistleblower program and work to ensure its full use to its full potential.
Senator Grassley, we are in complete alignment on this program.
Thank you. Next would be Senator Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bessent, welcome to Washington, D.C. You're getting a taste of what it's like here, which is an out-of-body experience for most people who are not acquainted with it. I happen to represent a state that has the 8th largest economy in the world. We think we understand the formula for economic growth and prosperity and opportunity, which are low taxes, a reasonable and modest regulatory footprint, and opportunities for people to prosper, and by prospering, invest and create opportunities for other people to pursue their dreams. We think there's a lot Washington can learn from that formula, and it sounds to me like you agree. One of the strange experiences I've had here is that so many of our colleagues, principally on the other side, think that the money that you earn is not actually yours. It's the federal government's, and you just get to keep a little bit of it. Conversely, I believe that the money that people earn is theirs, and they have a responsibility to pay taxes, but as you point out, an over-tax burden or large tax burden has a way of depressing the economy and reducing standard of living. So I'm grateful for your nomination, and I think you are exactly the type of individual that needs to serve in this important position, and I support your nomination wholeheartedly. Let me ask you, in the short time I have, one sort of obscure question and another one that we discussed in our office. As you know, the market for U.S. Treasuries is the largest market in the world at $28 trillion, and it's critical to the financial stability of the United States. There's actually a proposal for an entity to clear U.S. Treasury futures at the London Clearing House, which is overseen by the Bank of England. Some argue that the Bank of England would have control over heaven forbid, a default scenario in this critical market instead of the U.S. Is this a concern to you?
Senator Cornyn, I enjoyed visiting in your office, and I would note that while Texas has more arrivals due to good economic policies, South Carolina has more arrivals as a percent of the population, also driven by our wonderful governor, Henry McMaster.
I'm still going to vote for your nomination. I think it's 1,600 people a day in Texas, but go ahead.
Yeah, everything's bigger in Texas, sir. That Yeah, you raise a very important question, and one that I will investigate further. I was unaware until the past few days of this with the new exchange. What I can tell you is, as a student, a professor of economic history, that it is important for the U.S., for U.S. Treasuries, for us to be able to resolve any stress issues in the market in the U.S. We saw during the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy that many of the problems emanated from the UK subsidiary. So this is something that, thank you for bringing this to my attention, and my inclination is that the resolution authority must lie here in the U.S., but I will get back to you in writing with an answer on this if confirmed.
Thank you. You appropriately mentioned China as one of our biggest challenges. While I believe in free and fair trade, we know that some countries, principally the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, don't play by the rules. Over the years, by some estimates, U.S. investments in Chinese companies have totaled $2.3 trillion in market value. That was at the end of 2020. That included $21 billion. These are American companies investing in China. $21 billion in semiconductors, $54 billion in military companies, and $221 billion in artificial intelligence. So it's pretty clear to me that U.S. investments have fueled China's economic growth, which has allowed them not only an increased standard of living, which is great for the Chinese people, but problematically, it's also allowed them to modernize their military and now threaten the peace in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. As we discussed, I've introduced a bill that would require transparency of American companies investing in China. And of course, the entity that would receive the reports from American companies that do that, and since it's strictly a reporting requirement, would be Treasury. What's your view of an outbound investment transparency requirement?
Senator Cornyn, I believe that, as we discussed in your office, this is a very important issue. That the Chinese economy is the most unbalanced economy in the history of the world. They are using their surpluses to fund their military machine in China, and I'm not going to try the Mandarin pronunciation for the sake of everyone in the room, but there is a phrase that is two words: military, industrial, and military always comes first. So we should understand that, and that we should have a very rigorous screening process for, as you identified, anything that could be used in AI, in quantum computing, in surveillance, in chips, that the U.S. has the lead, and we must make sure that we maintain it through smart policies such as you and I discussed.
Thank you. We need to move on. Senator Bennett.
Mr. Bessent, thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, congratulations on your position. We look forward to working with you, as I always have. Mr. Bessent, thank you for your willingness to serve. We are at the beginning of what's going to be a vigorous conversation about the country's fiscal health. You've described our deficit as alarming, and yet you're here with the same Trump tax policy that has burdened the American people with another $2 trillion of debt that their kids and grandkids are going to have to pay back. And despite the conversation we've heard over here, clearly, the distribution of it was deeply, deeply, deeply unfair. 50% of it went to the top 5% of Americans, 75% of it, if you add the SALT, which even the Wall Street Journal won't support because it's so unbelievably outrageous, will go to the wealthiest 5% of Americans. The tax policy is one that's hard, it is, for some reason in this room, it makes sense to people. In America, I don't think there's been a mayor in the history of the United States whose tax policy has been to go to the people of New York City or of Atlantic City or even of Mar-a-Lago and said to them, I have an idea. I'm going to borrow more money than we have ever borrowed in the history of that community, and I'm going to spend it. And I would say, well, geez, I'm worried about that. I don't want us to borrow a bunch of money without knowing what it's going for. What is it going for? Is it going for schools? No. Is it going to compete with the Chinese in their defense? No. Is it going to pay for parks? No. Is it going to deal with the mental health crisis that we have in America? No. Is it going to pay to secure our border? No. What are you doing with the money, Mr. Bessent? What were you doing with the money, Mr. Mnuchin? What are you doing with the money, Mayor, in America? The answer is we are going to give it to the richest people in America, the richest people in our community, and expect that somehow that's going to trickle down to everybody else. That has been the Trump tax policy since the day he showed up, and no mayor in America would ever, with a straight face, say that's what they should do. And in fact, no America in history has done that. But to add insult to injury, you sit here, and Mr. Mnuchin sat here at his time and said, it's all going to be paid for by economic growth. We know that's not true. We know it costs $2 trillion. So while the benefit went to the richest people in America, the cost is being borne by the children of working people all over this country. And that's what's going to happen now. It's $4.6 trillion this time, not $2 trillion. And then you come here, and this is my question, Mr. Bessent, and you sneak into your opening statement that we have a spending problem, and what we have to focus on, as you said, is discretionary spending after your crocodile tears about how China is out competing us. And as you know, because you're a smart person, and you've spent a lot of time on Wall Street, just like your predecessor did, discretionary spending is about a third of our overall spending. 17% of what we spend is domestic. 17% roughly of what we spend is military spending, that spending you were talking about with respect to China. There are so many things I think you owe the American people after we have seen the catastrophe of the result from the tax cuts the last time and the fact that the benefits went to the wealthiest people. But don't you at least owe the American people a refund for the $2 trillion that they've already incurred because of the last round? Before you get to the $4.6 trillion, can't we think of a better idea in the halls here than cutting taxes for the wealthiest people and expecting that it will trickle down to everybody else when we have the profound needs that you have talked about? When we're living in an economy, you had the American dream. We heard you say that. Where fewer and fewer people can get ahead, where this generation of Americans is going to be the first generation to leave less opportunity, not more, to our kids and our grandkids, where we see massive income inequality and wealth inequality when Trump was president, when Biden was president. Can't we think of a better idea than that? And at a bare minimum, and this is tiny, don't we owe them an answer about what you are going to do to that 17% of discretionary spending, or even the third, before you come in here and say that the most important thing we should do is cut taxes for the richest people in America?
Senator, thank you. And I would respectfully disagree with much of your categorization in terms of the benefits accruing to the richest Americans. Actually, the share of taxes paid by the upper percent of Americans increased after TCJA. It went from 39 to 46%. The top 50% of Americans now pay 98% of taxes, and working families had real wage increases in 2018 and 2019, and going into 2020 pre-COVID. The CBO scoring for the Trump tax cuts got rescored by $1.5 trillion.
Make sure, because we're in the beginning of a long debate, that if you're going to rely on the CBO score for this, that you're going to be willing to rely on it for the things that you said it's no good.
Look, I'm not in love with CBO scoring.
I know that.
but-
That's why now you're relying on it. So I'm just saying, let's not, it's not funny money. This is the American people's money. We can do math. Every mayor in America has to do math. And we're going to insist that you do the math too, because we know George Soros understands the math when you work there, and you understand full well what's going on here, just like Steve Mnuchin did, just like Donald Trump does, and we're not going to let it happen against the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I again remind my colleagues, we need to hold our time to 5 minutes. Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Bessent, I'm always going to pronounce your name as if it was in South Louisiana, and I'm going to pronounce it with a French Bessent as opposed to Bessent. That's what those folks in South Carolina do. I'll try. Let me compliment you on substantive answers. Sometimes we get people here who just rope-a-dope, and they'll have a set of statements such as have been just delivered, and all due respect to my colleague, and they just rope-a-dope, and you actually give substantive answers. I thank you for that. By the way, I'm also, Lindsey Graham alluded to it, going back to tariffs, which Senator Wyden spoke of. I've been very concerned that countries like China manipulate environmental regulations. You point out that they're building 100 coal-fired plants over a period of time, and that whatever we do will not have an impact on global greenhouse gas emissions because China's putting up so many. I believe I've learned that that is called an externality in economics. When we met, we discussed the foreign pollution fee, which would put a levy, a tariff, on those carbon-intensive products coming from countries like China, roughly commensurate with their avoided cost of not controlling it. Now, I would think that my Democratic colleagues would like that, because that's clearly a way that they are manipulating the world economy to steal jobs from the United States and simultaneously increase global greenhouse gas emissions. Any comments on such a foreign pollution fee?
Senator Cassidy, I greatly enjoyed our discussion and the extensive presentation you gave me when I visited with you. And this is a very good question because, and I believe it is one for your Democratic colleagues to understand whether they would be in favor of the equivalent of a carbon tariff. That Senator Graham is in favor of it. And I think this is a very interesting idea that it could be part of a entire tariff program because I think President Trump hasn't taken office yet. But if confirmed, I look forward to working with him on various strategies, some that could be specifically aimed toward carbon, as you say, others that could be aimed toward unfair trade practices, unfair financing practices.
So if you will, there's externalities that a tariff can address. Those externalities in and of themselves hurt the pocketbook or the job prospects of an average American. Let me move on. I think you would agree with that. I applaud your goal to get our debt to GDP ratio down to 3%, or percent of our GDP down to 3%. But you studiously say that we can't talk about things like Social Security. And I think that's because routinely, if we talk about Social Security, we presume that there's going to be a cut in benefits or a raise in taxes. I think we spoke when we met. I and others have a bipartisan plan that would create a pension investment fund separate from the Social Security Trust Fund, and that, just like we do with our 401ks, invested in the broader economy and use the proceeds from that to offset the upcoming 25% cut in Social Security benefits that will occur if we don't address this problem. And just so folks get that, under current law, when the Social Security program goes insolvent in 8 years, per CBO, there'll be a 25% cut in benefits. Under the plan I and others have endorsed, it's a pension investment fund in which we, again, would invest in the broader economy with all the safeguards to keep the government from interfering. I mention that because it seems that other advisors to the president, incoming president, have spoken of creating an investment fund to benefit. Mr. Lutnick, I think, has. Mr. Paulson did on the campaign trail. What are your thoughts about that concept? I think they spoke about it as sovereign wealth. I'm speaking about it as a fund to bail out social social, not, by the way, all risk borne by the fund, none of the risk borne by the beneficiary, she would get her scheduled benefits. What are your thoughts on that?
So, Senator Cassidy, first of all, I want to emphasize that President Trump has said that Social Security and Medicare, they will not be touched. And I believe...
But I'm saying touch in a positive way, not cut benefits, not raise taxes, indeed increase benefits, and take that 25% cut off the table, just to make that clear.
No, I understand. And so those would not be touched. One of the tragedies of this blowout in the budget deficit is that we have to get our short-term house in order to start, before we can start implementing the smart plans such as yours. I do believe that there is discussion to leverage the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet, as we discussed in your office, in favor of a fund, whether it's a sovereign wealth fund, something, as you discussed, a supplemental fund. So that is very much in the mix. I look forward to getting back to you on it. President Trump hasn't taken office yet. If confirmed, this is something that I think could be very exciting, because we always look at the debt of the United States, and we have fantastic assets that could be earning, leveraged, or used for multiple revenue-generating opportunities.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations. Mr. Bessent, it's good to see you and enjoyed our meeting. I've got some specific questions I want to ask, but I don't want to litigate this now, but I do feel, as someone working with Senator Crapo and others, when we took on, I still think, the most comprehensive Post-Simpson-Bowles, and we took arrows from each side. And I'm looking at any kind of pro-growth policies possible, but I just respectfully want to say there is not an industrial nation, first world industrial nation in the world, that gets anywhere close to meeting their revenue needs, and I'm not proposing that America spend anywhere like the Europeans at 17 to 18% of GDP. It's never happened historically. It's not going to happen in a Trump administration or future Democratic administrations. So we'll have a time to talk back and forth on this, but I can't let some of this go without at least offering something that there's not an economist around that wouldn't concur. We got to bring down spend, but the revenue side alone is not, excluding that, we're never going to get to a balance. I do want to raise on a more positive note, again, something I worked closely with the chairman on, and actually worked with your predecessor on, and was very proud of that relationship. I disagreed with Secretary Mnuchin on a lot of things, but I found a lot of things to agree with him on. And one was a relatively narrow part of the financial sector called Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFIs. Under the previous Trump administration, we put about $12 billion in. This serves access to capital for underserved communities. Under Senator Crapo's leadership, we built a bipartisan CDFI caucus, 12 Ds, 12 Rs. It's tough to get 24 bipartisan senators agree on anything. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. There are things we can do to continue to expand this area, creating a secondary market. We've got some bipartisan legislation there, trying to reward patient capital. A lot of these institutions now have Tier 1 equity, but they've got to get patient capital. And again, Senator Crapo and I have worked with the current administration, would want to work with yours on something called the Economic Opportunity Coalition. But can you say a word or two about how you view CDFIs and this making sure that underserved communities get the access to capital so they can have their own American dream, how that fits into your lexicon?
Senator Warner, I enjoyed talking to you about CDFIs in your office. The early part of my career was as a financial services analyst, so I have a depth and breadth, and I believe that the breadth of the U.S. financial services industry is what makes the U.S. economy differentiates the U.S. economy from the rest of the world. And I think the addition of these CDFIs into underserved communities are very important.
Well, I appreciate that, and again, it's bipartisan, and there are, again, you understand markets well. If we could spark a secondary market in this debt, we could leverage, and I'm talking about private capital, and I know that's what my colleagues like a lot, private capital, but we can leverage it exponentially. One of the things we discussed, and again, we talked about this in my office, and I don't want to, one of the things I was happy to hear, I feel very strongly that we cannot reward Vladimir Putin's aggressive, outrageous behavior in Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainians have performed remarkably. Obviously, they have manpower issues. I see this from the intel side on a daily basis. One of the areas that I think we have not done as well, and candidly, the sanctions regime, I don't think was as effective as it should have been. And I frankly think the Biden administration waited too late to put some of these additional sanctions on oil and tankers. The ability to Russia to retool. Listen, I hope if President Trump can settle this, hallelujah, the world would be better off. But one of the things we discussed in my office was the potential to actually increase the sanctions regime as a way to help further leverage that. Would you care to talk for a moment about that again?
Yes, so Senator Warner, I believe that the sanctions regime, especially, well, first of all, I would say in my adult life that the tragedy going on in Ukraine is one of the greatest tragedies of my adult life, and ending that as soon as possible, and any role the Treasury can play in that, if confirmed, I would like to do. As we discussed, I believe that the sanctions were not fulsome enough. I believe that I believe that the previous administration was worried about raising U.S. energy prices during an election season, and I am perplexed to see that National Security Advisor Sullivan, on his way out the door, is raising the sanctions level on Russian oil companies, and indeed, the oil prices in the U.S. are up about 9% this month. So what was good for that administration is being foisted on us, but having gone from, I think, low-level sanctions to mid-level, that if any officials in the Russian Federation are watching this confirmation hearing, they should know that if I'm confirmed and if President Trump requests, and as part of his strategy to end the Ukraine war, that I will be 100% on board for taking sanctions up, especially on the Russian oil majors, to levels that would bring the Russian Federation to the table.
And I will only take 30 seconds. Let me just get 30 seconds. Thank you for that, because I think it's important that we don't take these tools out of the toolkit. We can litigate what the past administration did and when they did it, but increasing pressure on Putin to bring about a resolution, I very much appreciate your willingness, and I hope you will be an advocate for keeping those sanctions on and actually advancing them even further. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bessent, good to see you again. Thanks for the time in the office to be able to talk through a lot of these details as well. I was interested to be able to hear your statistic you shared earlier that after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, now we've had several years to be able to see what happens. And now I believe the statistic you gave is the top 50% of earners in America now pay 98% of the taxes. Did I hear that correctly? Because I've heard over and over again that it's only the wealthy, only the big companies that get it. I would encourage, quite frankly, every Oklahoma company that's a small business to ask their CPA this year when they're filing their taxes, what if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires next year? What would my taxes be next year? And have small business owners ask that question of their CPA, and I think they will be quite surprised, based on all the rhetoric, to say this is only about big companies and wealthy people, that every small business will quickly find out, oh, it's them as well. It'd be the same thing on the child tax credit. If Tax Cuts and Jobs Act goes away, it gets cut in half in the child tax credit, and all the inversions that were happening under the Obama administration, where American companies were being bought up by foreign entities, now that's actually switched. Now American companies are buying foreign companies, and those jobs are coming here. So there's been a tremendous amount of benefit in that. The one challenge that we've had on this committee has been a conversation with Janet Yellen about Pillar 2. And it started really 4 years ago now, 3 years ago, where the conversation was about, well, we really don't need Congress to act on this. We feel like we can do unilaterally. We can change America's tax policy for all businesses in America. And now in the last year, they've shifted to say, well, we're going to have to come back to you at some point to be able to get this. In the meantime, a deal has been negotiated that literally helps European countries and hurts the United States on this. And they negotiated a deal that exempts China from being affected by this at all. My question to you is, are you going to engage on this issue of Pillar 2? Number one, have this committee involved in writing taxes, which seems to be consistent with the Constitution. And then what is your message to other countries if they try to implement Pillar 2 on American businesses?
Thank you, Senator. As we discussed in your office, Senator Langford, that I believe that any, especially European country, but any country that in the next few days before President Trump takes office is intent on implementing Pillar 2 will find it a grave mistake. That the taxation of U.S. companies is a sovereign issue, and that authority lies with this Congress, and I will respect that. I will work with you to undo what I think has been a terrible policy.
Yeah, which I would agree, and many members in this committee would agree, that not only they went around Congress violating the Constitution, but it deliberately hurt American companies. And I just think that's really terrible policy on it. It truly was America Last policy. On the energy side, you've talked a lot about energy production. I'm Oklahoma, and unashamedly, we're all the above and all the below energy. We probably have more wind and hydro and solar production in my state than any other state on this dais, with very few exceptions, but we also use oil and gas. And we're going to produce all the energy that our state needs to be able to make sure that we stay stable on that. One of the issues that is a business issue for small or large businesses that I've been fighting for is a stable bonus depreciation amount. This is not about the type of energy or the type of business even. It's if you're actually investing in your company and trying to grow your company, that you would know what that bonus depreciation. Now, this will help with pipeline productions, but it will also help a pet shop and a hair salon and a restaurant just as much as well. And so thoughts on bonus depreciation and just a stable rate for that?
So, Senator Langford, you're referring to the 100% immediate?
Yes, what has been in the past, but for, quite frankly, a stable rate, period. Right now, we have a diminishing rate that's unpredictable.
Yes, so I think that increasing the after-tax return on capital for U.S. companies, especially small business, is one of the greatest forms of job creation that we could see. Yeah. And to go back to your point on energy production, we've heard much here today saying that we are at a record amount of energy production, and we know that's a canard. We are barely above where we were in 2020, and if we were to look at the Department of Energy projections for 2024 and 2025, we are well below those. The past 4 years, we have seen U.S. production constrained, and part of a fulsome sanctions program would mean that we need more energy production in the U.S. to make up for the loss of sanctioned Russian oil to protect the U.S. consumer.
Right, which is American jobs, which is American income, which one of the things we're going to have to deal with is the intangible drilling cost punishment that was actually put on all the independent oil and gas companies in my state and everywhere else that drives up the cost for consumers as well. That's another issue that this committee needs to take on. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, congratulations on your position. I look forward to working with you and all of our colleagues on the committee. And thank you, Mr. Bessent, for being being here. Congratulations on your nomination and for your willingness to serve, and welcome to your husband and children as well. We are grateful for their willingness to share you with the country. I appreciate you meeting with me in this process and sharing your priorities at Treasury if you are confirmed. And I want to follow up on some of those topics today. I also just want to associate myself with the comments of my colleagues, Senator Bennett and Senator Warner. I certainly believe we need to cut taxes for working people, and we need to make sure the wealthiest pay their fair share. And with regard to Senator Warner's comments on sanctions, you mentioned if Vladimir Putin is watching this hearing. He's not the only one watching this hearing. China is watching this hearing, and we have talked about the importance of making sure that we are not only competitive but outperforming China for economic purposes as well as for national security reasons. And as important as a resolution in Ukraine is, history tells us that appeasing tyrants at the expense of freedom fighters never works. And it is critically important not only for the Ukrainian people and for the freedom of all of us, but it is important because China and North Korea are also watching what we do and watching this hearing and how we will go forward imposing sanctions. To turn to some of the topics that we discussed when we met in my office, the research and development tax deduction was one of them. It's critical to helping us outcompete countries like China. Currently, China provides a 200% super deduction for R&D, while American businesses can only immediately deduct 10% for R&D. I've worked with Senator Young on a bipartisan effort to restore the full and immediate R&D deduction. So do you support restoring the full and immediate R&D deduction? Will you work with me and my colleagues to get this across the finish line in Congress?
Senator, I enjoyed the meeting in your office. I am not fully versed in this, but my inclination is that this is something that I would support, and I will get back to you, if confirmed, I will get back to you very quickly on it, and we'll make it a priority. Do you agree it's an important tool for American companies to improve their competitiveness? Yes, Senator.
Thank you. One of my other top priorities is working on a bipartisan basis to lower costs for families. Under President-elect Trump's policies, do you believe that prices for families will go up or down?
I believe that inflation will be much closer to the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. And I believe that what we have seen over the past few years is that the bottom two income quintiles have a very different basket of goods and services. So there are two ways. We can either lower cost or we can get real wages up. I would hope that we would be able to do both.
So you believe that President Trump's policies will further increase wages and lower inflation?
I believe that they will increase real wages and lower inflation closer to the Federal Reserve's 2% target as it did during President Trump's first administration.
Are there any specific policies proposed by the President-elect that you expect will increase prices for families?
Nothing I can immediately think of.
So that's a no. If the President-elect were to propose a policy that you believe will increase prices, would you advise against it?
I would speak to President Trump about it. It is his decision, and I believe that we think that if we look back, that it is a complete composite return in terms of aggregate inflation numbers, and I think it's very difficult.
Well, I have limited time, so if you believe that a policy that is proposed by President Trump would increase prices, would you advise him against doing it? Yes or no?
I can't answer that question because it's a hypothetical.
All right, let's move on to, when we met prior to the hearing, you told me that President Biden was responsible for increased prices over the past 4 years, something we can litigate, but I don't want to right here. By the same token, I assume you would agree that if prices increase in the next 4 years, President-elect Trump would be responsible.
I think there could be a variety of reasons. I think that it could be We will see the policies of the Federal Reserve, the spending policies. Congress sets the spending policies.
So, look, I'm going to cut to the chase because I'm out of time, but at the end of the day, what you're articulating is a double standard, and it's disappointing to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Bessent, good to have you here this morning. I think we're seeing here in this committee is we really do have a divide between two very different philosophies about how to go forward and what's best for the American people in this economy and what's best for global competitiveness. I remember sitting right in this chamber as we were debating whether or not we should launch the multiple trillion-dollar massive spending bills, which is a $2 trillion COVID bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, massive multi-trillion-dollar bills that even Democrat former secretaries of Treasury said could be inflationary, and indeed it was. You compare that outcome to what we are going to return back to the policies of the prior Trump administration, that when you lower taxes for businesses and the American people, you create more tax revenue, you create more economic activity, you create more wage growth, particularly for minorities as well. And you start to get back into winning in terms of global competitiveness. We stopped the inversions. It was absolutely like, boom, went from multiple inversion to zero once we move forward with this. And I couldn't be prouder of what we did boldly back during the Trump administration. We tried to fight against during this administration, these massive out-of-control spending bills that were inflationary, and the American people suffered greatly with these high levels of inflation, higher mortgage rates, and so forth. And so I'm glad to have you, as our next Secretary of Treasury, work with you to restore sanity back to where we were under President Trump. So congratulations on your nomination and your willingness to serve. With the expiration coming of these tax rates, we're facing a $4.3 trillion tax increase if we don't act this year. As we begin drafting this bill, and I applaud Chairman Crapo, he brought us together as ranking member last year prior to getting the majority back, anticipating we might have this moment. And we started talking about what are some key themes. Then we got into the details over several months of working groups for this next tax bill to renew and preserve the tax rates and prevent a $4 trillion tax increase. One of the key words was permanency. Permanency. I've expressed my support for the use of current policy baseline. I've expressed my support for permanency because we add uncertainty here in Congress with expiring tax code provisions. It's time to make them permanent, to take one additional burden away from the American people wondering what's going to happen with Congress, whether my tax rates will depend on what happens in the next election or what happens if Congress can act. Let's take that off the table with permanency. My question, Mr. Bessent, is you've said we need to grow our way out of our current economic situation. I couldn't agree more. And that's just the philosophical divide we face here. Somebody who embraces more the supply side idea, reduce rates, unleash capital into the free markets and let those markets decide where that investment relies versus a bunch of bureaucrats here in Washington with wasteful spending. How does permanency and certainty of the tax code affect our ability to grow out of these problems?
Senator Daines, I've enjoyed getting to know you over the past year with your work on the National Republican Senate Committee and talking to you in your office, and also discussing your history in the private sector, both of the big company and small companies. And a question like that makes it clear to me that you understand the incentives, that it is incentives that drive everything in tax policy. And I can tell you that since November 5th, for small businesses, we have seen the biggest increase in optimism since they have been keeping the metrics. So certainty, small business owners, many of whom they are pass-through corporations, believe that we will get the tax TCJA across the line. I think we could see a bigger increase in optimism in economics when we have